Okay, so this week we're going to continue the topic of how children learn language, and we're going to compare and contrast that with how machines learn language. And this is a very interesting thing to ask because there's obviously a lot of attention being paid to things like ChatGPT and other kinds of large language models, which do a really good job of approximating human language. So it naturally raises the question, why are we so interested in this whole universal grammar, poverty the stimulus stuff if these machines are able to learn language pretty darn well, right? I mean, it kind of raises the question that maybe we've been thinking about this wrong the whole time. And many people have, in fact, said that. Many people, in fact, have said, look at ChatGPT, maybe we don't really need all this kind of Chomskyan universal grammar stuff. And so I think it's really worth addressing, and I think we should think about this carefully. The other reason why it's important to talk about this is we've already had this conversation. This is not a new debate. This debate took place in the 80s and 90s between Steven Pinker, who is a psychologist who kind of took the, let's call it, pro-linguistics position, and contrasted this with a group of computational cognitive scientists who argued that machine learning approaches do a really good job and might actually be a better theory after all. So here we're going to talk about these. As I'm sure I did last week as well. I obviously have biases and I have kind of a horse in this race, and I will kind of acknowledge my own opinion when that becomes relevant. But I will do my best to try to stay neutral and try to describe the debate on its own terms. So last time, right, we talked about the poverty the stimulus argument, just to refresh our memories a bit. The poverty the stimulus argument is really two different arguments, one that's kind of a more abstract or more general point and a more specific point. And the more general abstract point is that the input to children is not enough to learn language because no amount of input is in principle enough to learn anything unless the child has some prior hypotheses, some prior biases, some representational capacity to formulate and compare hypotheses, right? The child can't be a blank slate and learn stuff. That's just not really a possibility, right? That's the bigger version of the poverty the stimulus argument. The more specific argument, and the one that is kind of more testable, I guess, or kind of easier to address, is that the amount of input to children underdetermines the hypothesis that children seem to pursue compared to some alternative hypotheses that also seem feasible, right? So the example that we saw, that is often the example that people use to illustrate this point, is the example of structured dependence, meaning that, for instance, if we're trying to formulate the rule for yes-no question formation in English, we need children to only consider the hypothesis that the main clause auxiliary moves to the front of the sentence, but not, say, the first auxiliary or the second or the last auxiliary. So we walked through that argument a little bit last time, and there's different ways to think about that. But again, the basic point is that it's interesting to think about what the input actually looks like, and it's also interesting to think about what kinds of hypotheses the child could consider in principle. And the solution to the poverty to stimulus argument, both the bigger and the smaller one, is that children's initial state, meaning whatever children are born with, whatever comes for free with a human brain, contains some structure to it that permits learning, right? So there's some reason everybody has to admit that a human being, a human baby, can learn language, but the smartest cat or the smartest primate can't. So there has to be some explanation for that has to be rooted in biology somehow. And the one solution to that solution, or one way to think about that solution, right, Chomsky's proposal, and one that I personally find to be convincing, is that that child's initial state has to include some kind of grammatical information, right? There's some way that grammar works that children know, and some information kind of falls out from the architecture of the grammar that's pre-specified in the child. Now, that could be wrong, right? That's controversial. I think it's a good theory personally, but not everybody does. And so that's kind of why we have this conversation. Now, What about LLMs, right? What about large language models? As I said before, large language models, ChatGPT kind of being one of the most famous ones at the moment, are pretty darn good at mimicking human language. And it's really worth thinking about why and how do they do that? Because the way that large language models work is actually kind of simple. Like the way that they work under the hood is fairly straightforward. So I should say ChatGPT specifically is actually a proprietary system. So it's not open source. People can't go and just download the code. So we don't know exactly how ChatGPT specifically works, but we know in general that these large language models are a class of what are called neural networks. And neural networks are, again, actually a fairly simple system. The idea is that we have some inputs that could be a word, that could be an image, that could be anything you might think of. And then we also have some layer of outputs, and that could be the next word, that could be a description of an image, that could be, if the input is an email, that output can be a determination whether it's a spam email or not, right? There's all kinds of ways you can develop neural networks. And then the magic happens by having some number of layers that are interspersed between the input and the output. And what these layers do, good question, right? These layers are kind of free parameters. They're kind of unspecified as to what their function is, but each layer is connected to the adjacent layers, and each node in this system has a connection to the other nodes in the system. And then what happens is we train this network on lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of data, and then the network adjusts the weights between the different nodes so that the inputs get the right answers of the output, and then we can deploy it to new cases. So this specific kind of toy model that I sketched here is what's called a feed-forward model. This is not the only kind of neural network, and of course things like ChatGPT are a little bit more complicated than this, but that's the basic underlying premise, right? Is it's some system that goes from inputs to outputs, mediated by a bunch of intermediate layers that get to do various things that we adjust dynamically in some training process. Right, so that's the basic idea behind things like ChatGPT and so on. These systems usually are what makes a large language model large is that they have many parameters. So I've seen one number as ChatGPT is estimated to have around 175 billion parameters, which means there's 175 billion nodes and connections between these nodes. They're trained on lots of data, so basically the entire internet, which can be terabytes and terabytes of data. And again, they're able to produce remarkably human-like language, and that's part of the reason why linguists are interested in these things. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning is that these are called neural networks for a reason. We know that this is basically how neurons work as well. So that means that neurons fire, that means basically exchanging a charged ion particle from one to the next, and then through complex interactions and complex networks of neurons interfacing with other neurons, complex representations and functions get spelled out, get cached out, right? So the idea is that neural networks, they're not really a model of the brain per se, but they operate on similar principles to the brain. And for that reason, right, if we can model complex human behavior with a neural network, maybe we might guess that the brain is doing something similar as our neural network. And that's the idea. And so, and I really want to stress that these systems are pretty impressive. So, previously, ChatGPT did not know who I was, but now seems to, actually. So if you ask ChatGPT about me, it will give you a correct description of me, which kind of shocks me. To be fair, most of the text that is elicited when you ask ChatGPT about me is text that a human wrote. So some of this is text from my website that I wrote. Some of the text is from different universities that I've worked at. But some of it isn't. Some of this, I think, is genuinely novel text. So that's kind of impressive, right? I wanted to do this exercise of showing ChatGPT not knowing who I was as kind of a self-deprecating joke, but somewhere between the last time I've ChatGPT'd myself and today, ChatGPT learned who I was. So that's a little bizarre. just to kind of like drive this point home, after asking ChatGPT about myself, I asked ChatGPT whether ChatGPT disproves the universal grammar hypothesis. And to its credit, ChatGPT gave the correct answer, which is we don't really know. It says that's a great and very current question, one that's generating a lot of debate among linguists and cognitive scientists. In short, large language models, LLMs, like me, challenge some aspects of the UG hypothesis, but they don't disprove it outright. And then ChatGPT volunteered my opinion for me, where Dustin Chacon might stand. Given Chacon's focus on syntax, cross-linguistic variation, and neurolinguistics, he might be especially interested in how LLMs handle cross-linguistic generalizations and whether they show human-like neural signatures of syntactic processing. He'd likely see LLMs as informative, but insufficient on their own to explain language acquisition and processing in the human brain. I have to say, my jaw dropped when I read that, because that's exactly right. That is essentially my opinion about LLMs and what they tell us about universal grammar. So, I have to give flowers, I have to give credit where credit's due here. ChatGPT knows me, right? So that's pretty astonishing, right? So that's impressive. So we're gonna come back to this question of, does ChatGPT, overrule the universal grammar hypothesis? ChatGPT itself says no, but I will kind of spell that out for you a little bit more. But before we do that, as I said, we have already had this conversation. This is not a new debate. And it's worth knowing that. It's worth reminding ourselves why this debate took place, like why we already had this debate. Like why, how has this already come up in the broader cognitive science field? So, as I said, the first time we had this debate concerned a much smaller part of the grammar, which is the form of a past tense verb, or alternately, the form of a plural of a noun. So why is that an interesting thing to talk about? Well, it's interesting because, as I said, it's a bit of a microcosm for how the grammar works in general. So if I give you some verb forms like kick, hug, and test, and I asked you what the past tense verb was, I'll give you a second. I'm sure that you said kicked, hugged, and tested, right? Pretty obvious thing here, right? Pretty clear. These are regular verbs, which means we have a form that is highly predictable and that is systematic across those forms. Now, if I give you another set of verbs, make, do, and see, I'll give you a second. You can pause the video, but I'm sure you already have given me the past tense form. It's going to be made, did, and saw. Now, I'm going to give you another 4 verbs, and I want you to, again, think about this and tell me what verb forms you think are the past tense forms of these. I think, it might actually be worth pausing the video, maybe writing down your answers or thinking about for a second, because you might give different answers depending on who you are or who you ask, right? So people sometimes give different answers for these. So if we have the verbs drive, dive, sneak, and strike, we might get drived, we might get drove. One time, I swear I heard someone say drove. For dive, you might get dived, but you also might get dove. For sneak, you might get sneaked, you might get snuck, you might get snook, which is, again, a form that I promise you I have heard a human say before. For strike, you probably will get striked, but you also might get struck, right? I think I say struck, actually. I think I say, he struck out. And we also have intuitions about verb forms that we haven't heard before. So if I give you novel verbs like spling, sprive, or yeek, you might say splinged, you might say splung, you might say splang, you might say sprive, you might say sprove, you might say, you might say sprived. For yeek, you probably are going to say yeeked, but you might say yuck, right? So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. These are sometimes called subregularities, and that these are kind of irregular, but kind of not. And they're kind of predictable, but kind of not, right? So the first thing to mention is that we do know that children figure this out pretty early-ish, let's say. You may have been exposed to the so-called WUG test before. This is a very famous experiment in the history of linguistics and language acquisition. The WUG has kind of de facto become a mascot of the field, although the copyright owners of the WUG are a bit litigious, so they don't always like when people use the WUG, but that's a different question. So the WUG test is a test that examines whether and how children can create novel morphological forms. And the WUG test actually had a couple of points to it. There was a few questions that they were interested in asking. The first was, when and do, the first question was, do children know how to generate new morphological forms, new plurals, new past tenses? Second of all, when they produce those forms, do they choose the right phonological form? So the allomorph, the morpheme for the plural and the morpheme for the past have different allomorphs. And those allomorphs are dependent in part based off of the voicing of the preceding consonant and also whether the preceding consonant has a shared feature. So the plural form has an allomorph z that is produced after a voice stop, a voiceless form that's pronounced after a voiceless stop, and then also another form z that's produced with a intervening schwa if it's after another sibilant. So we say cats, glasses, and kids, right? And similarly for the past tense, we have the t allomorph, which is produced after a voiceless stop. We have ud, produced after a voiceless coronal, is what I should say here. And then finally, we have the d form that kind of appears elsewhere. So the way that the WUG test works is that we give children a novel object with a novel label in the singular or in the present tense, if it's a verb, and then we ask them to produce the plural form or the past tense form with some prompt. So this is a WUG. Now there is another one. There are two of them. There are two WUGs, I hope you said, right? I hope you didn't say something else. WUGs is basically the predicted answer. And so, as I said, Burko was interested in knowing whether children knew these rules, whether they knew the right form of the phoneme, and also she wanted to know whether children was susceptible to these kinds of subregularities. So as I said, the WUG is kind of a de facto mascot. It's a cute little bird thing, but there are other members of this cohort. So I found this this alignment chart of the different creatures and different activities in the WUG test. There's a whole booklet. You can actually find all the images online if you search. So we have things like WUG, right, which has the plural form WUGs. We have things like a gutch with the plural form gutches. And we have the kaj with the plural form cages. We have the verb bod with the past tense bodded. We have the verb gling, which has the past tense forms glinged, but maybe glang, maybe glung. And we also have a verb form spow, which is my favorite, which means to stand with a teapot on your head. And this obviously has the past tense form spowed, right? And so on and so forth. There's a whole, litany of these. And so what Burko found was around ages 4 to 7, children basically figured this out. So children started producing basically the right form of the right plural form of the noun or the right past tense form of the verb around this age. Now, there's more to say here. There are some differences between different forms. So it turns out, for instance, that 4-year-olds were not doing so well with the plural form of the word niz. They were not so good at producing nizzes, but they were very good at producing the form glasses, right, or wugs. 5 and 7-year-olds on the whole were better than the 4 to 5-year-olds, but there was also some variety there from different structure to different structure. And Burko also points out that around this age, children demonstrate some knowledge of morphology. They start revealing that they notice that words have structure and that words have there's some reason why words have the structure that they have. These are very cute. So for instance, Burko reports that a child says an airplane is called an airplane because it is a plane thing that goes in the air. Breakfast is called breakfast because you have to eat it fast when you rush to school. Thanksgiving is called that because people give things to one another. So that means that this child is actually parsing this as Thingsgiving. Friday is a day when you have fried fish. A handkerchief is a thing you hold in your hand and you go kerchew, right? So very, very cute. But this demonstrates that children are basically realizing that words have structure to them, that structure has some relationship to the form and to the meaning, and that there's some logic to word structure. Just a couple more points here, right? So we also found in this study, not we, I was not alive yet, but Burko found in this study that children were susceptible to some kinds of subregularities as well. And there was some kind of interesting discrepancies between different forms, as I already mentioned. So, for instance, children did say binged for the past tense of bing, but for a verb like spow, they were about, even the older cohort was giving about 60% of the time the form spowed, and they gave different forms in other cases. For mot, they gave motted only about 30% of the time, and so on. And so the findings are actually quite complex, and I think sometimes the complexity is underreported. But if this were a language acquisition class, we might spend a little bit more time thinking about that. But it just suffices to point out that around age 4 or 5, children basically got the picture down, right? They basically know what's going on with the regular form. This then raises the question, well, what about the irregulars? And that's where things become a little bit more interesting. So, what do we know about the irregulars? Well, one of the things that we observe is something called a U-shaped learning curve. A U-shaped learning curve is something that we actually see in other contexts when children are learning language, and I believe in learning other things as well, where children start in earlier ages showing very good accuracy, meaning basically showing adult-like behavior, right? So they look like adults at first, and then they get bad. And then suddenly they seem to not behave adult-like, and then they slowly creep back to adult-like behavior. So in other words, when we're looking at how children produce irregular forms of verbs, they start out by saying made, did, saw, and then they start saying maked, doed, and seed, and then they slowly return to saying made, did, and saw. And so we can see this by using things like the WUG test, and we can also see this by charting individual children in something like Childus. So we already talked about Childus before. Childus is the repository of corpora of child-directed speech and children's productions. And within individual children, we can see how these develop over time, over ages, right? And so why should that be? Why should children start off doing well with irregular forms and then suddenly get bad and then slowly get better? Well, one view is what Steven Pinker proposed in his words and rules model. Before I talk about this, I almost feel compelled to say, right, so Steven Pinker these days is not really well known for his work on child language acquisition and the acquisition of morphology. He's mostly known for his Twitter presence, which is something I feel kind of worth addressing because, yeah, anyway, well, he has a lot of opinions about a lot of things, many of which I don't personally agree with, but that's neither here nor there. That's what I mentioned. Yes, we're talking about that Steven Pinker. At one point, he has contributed significantly to theories of language acquisition before he got a Twitter account. So anyway, the words and rules model says that children start off by memorizing every past tense, right? So in other words, every verb form is treated as if it were irregular. If you hear the verb kick, then you memorize that the form is kicked. If you hear the verb jump, then you memorize the form is jumped. If you hear the verb make, then you memorize that the form is made, right? So you don't know that many verbs yet, so you just memorize each one. Simple as that. And then at some point you think, holy cow, this is a lot of verbs. What's going on here? Why are there so many verbs that I'm memorizing? Wait a second. I've noticed that so many of these verbs that I've memorized end in ud in the past tense. Here's a new hypothesis. My language has a way of generating a past tense form, and that way is by sticking an ud at the end of the verb. I don't need all this nonsense of these memorized forms. Let's get rid of that list, right? So I've made a more compact description of my language, which says I can generate a new past tense form by adding an ud. Yeah? And then I have this new tool, which is this regular rule that I over apply. So now every verb is treated as if it were regular. And then I realized I made a mistake. Right now I realize that I've overdid it. It turns out actually I do need to memorize that the past tense of make is made, the past tense of do is did, and the past tense of see is saw. But apart from that shorter list, everything else can be captured with this rule. So now that I have this rule, I can then add in a list of some exceptions, and now I have two pieces, right? So this is called the words and rule model because there's two parts. There's the words, the stuff that's memorized, the stuff that's stored in the lexicon as is. So those are the irregular verbs, the irregular plurals, and then all of the stems, all of the regular present tense form of the verbs, all of the singular nouns, and so on. And then I also have some rules. The rules say things like attach ud to make the past, or attach z to make the plural, and so on. And then I also have to add in something like a blocking rule. So that means if I have an irregular form memorized in my lexicon, if I know that the past tense of the verb make is made, then I shouldn't say maked, right? I should not apply the regular rule in that context. And this is very good at explaining that U-shaped curve, and it's also good at explaining that children normally over-regularize. That means that when children make a mistake, when they're on that bottom of that U-shaped curve, for instance, they don't make a mistake in which they accidentally produce an irregular form that they weren't supposed to. They accidentally produce a regular form that isn't adult-like. So instead of saying held, they might say holded. But they never go the other way. They never accidentally say felled instead of folded, right? So it's one direction where they make a mistake. And this model predicts that, right? That's actually compatible with this view. This hooks into a bigger theory of how the mind works, which says that we have knowledge or memory that is split into two ways, split into at least two different kind of versions or two different compartments. We have our procedural knowledge or our procedural memory, which is our memory of how to do things, right? So for instance, riding a bike or driving a car or humming your favorite song, something like that. But then we also have words that are declarative, which are facts or kind of propositions or statements, right? So like your mom's birthday is an example of declarative memory. And so this is an important distinction, right? Because we know, for instance, that sometimes people with amnesia might maintain procedural knowledge but might forget declarative knowledge, for instance, right? Someone might say, I don't know how to drive a car, but then you put them in a car and suddenly they know how to drive, right? So for instance, that's kind of an example of a reason why this is a useful distinction. Okay, so that's one view. And if you've learned about irregular forms in your intro class or in a morphology class, you've probably learned a version of this. And I think this is de facto kind of the default way that linguists think about irregular forms, right? The irregular forms have to be memorized, and the regular forms are kind of produced by some general principle. And I think that has to basically be right. I think that's some version of that has to be right in some respect. Yeah. I'll mention something later on because there's some reason to think that this is maybe not exactly the right way to think about morphology, but that's a bit controversial. But I will say something about that towards the end here. But right, as I said, I think this basic view is kind of the standard way that we now think about these kinds of things in linguistics. So what's the alternative? So where does artificial intelligence come in? Well, there's another way to think about this. Another way to think about this was proposed by McClellan and Rumelhart. And McClellan and Rumelhart suggest that we can actually model this stuff without any of this nonsense about words or rules or whatever. We don't need any of that, right? All of that is a theoretical excrescence. It's all unnecessary, right? We can get by with a really simple model that looks pretty familiar. I mean, this is basically what the little feed-forward model that I drew for you earlier, where we have a layer of inputs, which correspond to the present tense form of a verb, and then we have a layer of outputs, which is the past tense form of the verbs, and then we have some stuff in the middle that helps us go from one to the next, and that's all you need. And then you train that on some words, and you get the output, you get the answer. Part of the innovation was that they decompose words into what they call Wickle features or Wickle phones. So I forget what the Wickle means. They explain in the paper. I just forget at the moment. But the basic idea is we can think about word forms as a phonological sequence of trigrams, right? So the word strip, for instance, has str, tri, and rip, and also kind of with the stop characters, right? So just st, stra, stri, rip, ip, and puh, right? That's how we can think about the representation of the word strip. And we can then map that onto the Wickle features, right? So that is kind of the assembly of different phonological features. So the idea is that we associate phonological representations of the root form or the present tense form of the verb with a layer of the Wickle features of the present tense or the root form. We align that, or we connect that to a layer of the Wickle features of the past tense, and then from that past tense we get the Wickle feature representation of the past tense. We get the full past tense form of that verb. A very simple model, right? This is nothing like ChatGPT. This is way simpler, but the underlying math is the same, right? And the underlying idea of how learning works is basically the same. And guess what? This gets the U-shaped learning curve pretty well. So this model gets the regular form of verbs pretty darn quickly, and it also gets the irregular forms correct at first, and then gets them wrong, and then slowly returns to accuracy over some time. So this obviously is not in terms of the age of a child, but in terms of iterations of training. So again, this is a neural net, which means it has to be trained over and over and over and over again on some data set. So as it gets retrained, its performance gets better on the irregulars, and then suddenly gets worse in a U-shaped curve fashion, and then slowly returns to being better. So that's pretty compelling, I think. I mean, I think that's an interesting argument. And as I said, that if that works, that's really nice, because the neural net framework is not exactly a model of the brain, but it could be, right? Like we could start trying to determine whether there's an analogy with how actual human brains work. It models children's behavior without all of this kind of complexity of a grammar or rules or a list of irregular exceptions and so on. So does it work, right? I mean, is this a good model of how humans learn things? Again, there's a very clear echo here to thinking about things like ChatGPT. It looks like it produces something human-like. So is this a good model of what humans do? Well, obviously, Pinker was not convinced. Like all scientific debates, right? Usually it's rare in a scientific debate where one side actually relinquishes ground. Usually what happens is just that person who's standing on their side of the debate ends up being the only person left who kind of stands that side, and then, at some point they retire, and then that side goes away. This is still a live debate, I think, but, Pinker obviously responded to Rimmelhart McClelland, and they said, that's a fun toy, but that's nothing like what children do, right? So, yeah, okay, it's cute that you get that U-shaped curve. That's nice. That's a fun result. But what did the training look like? Well, the training looked like it worked by providing the model with a whole bunch of present past pairs of verbs, right? So the input to that model was, here's the present form of a verb, and here's the past. Kick, kicked, jump, jumped, see, saw, do, did, make, made. That is not what the input looks like. That is not what children hear. Children are not exposed to verb paradigms, right? They hear a verb in the context of a sentence, and then the child has to somehow figure out that went and go are supposed to be part of the same verb. That's actually a pretty hard thing to solve. I actually don't know if we know how children figure that out, to be honest with you. That's a pretty complicated idea, right? So first of all, the input just doesn't look like that. And second of all, the learning algorithm doesn't look like that. First of all, children do not get to hear a whole bunch of verbs over and over and over and over again, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. Sometimes children learn from a small set of data, as we talked about before, right? Sometimes we mentioned fast mapping before. Children might learn very quickly from a very small number of observations, So having to train iteratively on the same tokens of training data over and over and over and over again hundreds of times is probably not how children learn things. And neural networks are supervised learning models. So if you've taken computational linguistics, you might have heard this term before. A supervised learning model is a learning model in which the model learns some input, it guesses what it thinks the output should be, and then the model gets rewarded or punished based off of whether it made the right answer. It gets feedback, which it then uses to update its parameters. It uses to re-rank its weights between its nodes in the case of a neural network, and then it gets to try again until it gets the right answer. Guess what children don't get? They don't get systematic supervision like this. Every time a child produces an incorrect morphological form, their parents don't say, hang on, honey, it's not seed, it's saw, right? And we also know that even when parents do correct their children, the child usually doesn't really care, to be honest. The child is usually not all that interested in their parents' correction. Now, that's not to say that children never learn from correction. That's not to say that it's not useful in some circumstances. But what we do know is that it's not the case that all children get supervision every time they make an error, right? We know that every single time a child makes an error, their parents don't correct them. Or if their parents do correct them, we know that not every single child learns from that correction. So, for that reason, right, that's not a good approximation of how learning works in human children. And lastly, what kinds of errors do they make? Well, it turns out the kinds of errors that these systems make, that the Rumelhart-McClellan model makes when it's learning, is not like what children do. Reminder, what do children do? They over-regularize. So instead of saying held, they say holded. But they never go the other way around. They never take the verb fold and say felled instead of folded. Or at least when they do, it's extremely rare. These models do not do that. These models love to over-irregularize. So for instance, if you give the model the verb male, which it was not trained on, it might produce a form like membled, Pinker and Ullman point out. If you give it a form like trilb, you might get something like treelib. If you give it something like smeege, you might get a very weird form leaflogue, which is one of my favorites. And if you give it the verb frilg, you might get something like frieseled. So this is not right, right? This is not a good model of what humans do. So what I want you to notice here, right, is when we think about things like ChatGPT, we should be asking ourselves, what does the input look like? What does the learning algorithm look like? And what behavior does this model produce? Now that should sound familiar. Last week I said, when we studied child language acquisition, there's really 3 questions we should be asking. What does the input look like? What is a possible learning algorithm? And what does the behavior look like, right? Pinker is applying exactly the same logic that we apply to studying human children to these systems. And the answer is, this does not look like human language learning, right? And that's important because if the question that we're trying to answer scientifically is how do children do things, then we need to know what the input to children looks like. We need to think about what the child's learning algorithm looks like. And then we need to do experiments on children to see what they know, what they learn, and what they produce, and what kinds of errors they make. And when we apply that logic to this Rumelhart-McClellan model, it looks pretty weird, right? It does not seem to scale up. It does not seem to mirror what we know what children's experience looks like. Pinker also argues that his model is really not just about morphosyntax, but it's a more general picture of the grammar. And again, I think Pinker is right on this, right? So Pinker points out that, look, every theory of grammar needs to have some kind of compositional system, right? We have to be able to build bigger structures that we haven't used before. We have to be able to, for instance, use syntax or build more complex word forms that maybe we haven't heard before. But we also we just have to memorize stuff, right? You just have to memorize somehow that the past tense form of go is went. There just is no other way around that, right? If you're trying to understand what humans do. And I think, again, and I think he is right here, right? So the distinction here between declarative and procedural knowledge of language, I think, is just obviously right. I just think that is true. Every theory of grammar has to have some rules for how to compose bigger units and the atoms from which you do the composition. But Pinker also has a more subtle linguistic argument that his theory specifically is right about morphology. And I think it's also worth mentioning because this is the kind of thing that can't really fall out of the McClelland and Rumelhart model. Remember, the McClelland and Rumelhart model is really just mapping between triplets of phonemes to triplets of phonemes. But we know that the form, that whether an irregular form applies is dependent on the morphological structure that stem is embedded in. So Pinker points out that sometimes we can compound a verb stem, or we can embed it in a bigger morphological structure, and if we do that, sometimes the irregular form still applies, and sometimes it doesn't, and it's predictable. So Pinker points out that exocentric structures, which means that the stem of the word does not have a meaning that applies to the broader word. Okay. In those cases, we don't see projection of the irregular form, but in endocentric words in which the stem of the word, that meaning of the stem applies in some sense to the bigger word, then we do see the irregular form emerging. Okay, I said that in kind of a complicated way. So what do I mean? Here are two examples, right? Think about the verb stand. Stand, we all know what the verb stand means, I hope, right? The past tense of the form stand is stood. But we can include that stem stand in the verb grandstand. So grandstand does not actually have anything to do with standing, right? Grandstand means to give a kind of self-important speech or to self-aggrandize or something, right? It has nothing to do with standing. And because it has nothing to do with standing, the past tense is not grandstood, it's grandstanded. Similar, so you can kind of think of it as like the past tense is applying not to stand, but to grandstand. So grandstand does not have an irregular form, so it's the regular form. Similarly, if we think about plurals, right, life has the irregular form lives. But a low life is not a kind of life. A low life is, a ne'er-do-well or a vagabond or something, right? It's not a kind of life, it's a kind of person. And therefore, the plural form is not low lives, it's low lifes. Another example that is often used, I don't know anything about this because I don't know anything about sports, is that the sports team, hockey team, I think, the Maple Leafs is not the Maple Leaves, because obviously a hockey team, ? Is not a kind of leaf, right? It's a kind of hockey player. Therefore, you don't say Maple Leaves, you say Maple Leafs, yeah? But contrast that with to overeat. So eat is a verb, right? And the past tense of that is ate. And obviously everyone knows what to eat means. Overeating does mean a kind of eating, right? If you overeat, then you eat in abundance or you eat too much or something, right? So therefore, the past tense form is irregular. You do say overate, but not overeated. And so the way that Pinker thinks about this, right, is that the form of that verb gets to project if, the irregular form of that verb gets to project if the meaning gets to project. So we have this mapping between the kind of morphological structure, the semantics for that morphological structure, and the application of irregular forms. Pinker might not be totally right. So if you ask a morphologist about this, they will tell you that actually this is a little bit more complicated than that, right? A morphologist will tell you Pinker's idea is interesting, it's just not quite empirically right, and this is usually the case in morphology, things are actually pretty complicated, and there's a lot of exceptions, and it's actually really hard to give a totally kind of, ask a morphologist about this. It's more complicated than how Pinker spells it out. The other thing that Pinker points out, which again, I will say as a neurolinguist is a little bit more complicated than this, but the kind of argument Pinker is giving here is interesting, right? the argument that Pinker gives is that we see in brain damaged patients a double dissociation between the production of regular forms and the production of irregular forms. So if someone has brain damage to left temporal parietal regions, which I'm showing you here on a brain map, the part that's highlighted in orange, people who brain damage here sometimes struggle with irregular forms. So they say swimmed, but not swam. This left temporal parietal region includes part of what's sometimes referred to as Wernicke's area. So you might remember our good friends Paul Broca and Carl Wernicke. This is part of Wernicke's area. Well, depending on who you ask. That's a different question. So it turns out it's possible to find people with brain damage who cannot produce the irregular forms, but have no problem producing the regular forms. And then you can find people who have the exact opposite problem. So you have people with damage to left inferior frontal cortex and also anterior portions of temporal cortex. This again includes part of Broca's area, our good friend Paul Broca. You find the reverse pattern. You find people who struggle to produce the regular forms, but have no problem producing the irregular forms. So they have a problem with the compositional rules of grammar, but they have no problem with the atomic units of grammar. So they have no problem saying swam, but they struggle to say kicked. Now, Rumelhart and McClelland's model has nothing to say about this, right? Because it's all part of one system. But if Pinker is right, this is some neuroscientific evidence that these are not the same system, that these are in fact different systems. Now, again, I find this to be an interesting argument. I'm not sure that it's totally empirically right, personally. But it is an interesting argument. And it's the kind of argument that says something about humans that doesn't quite follow from the kind of computational model that Rumelhart and McClelland were putting forth. I want to say, I guess I've already made this point once already, but I do want to say that there's a more interesting rebuttal to Pinker, which is that his theory of morphology is not quite right. And so I want to point out a blog post by Alec Morantz. If you've studied morphology before, you might find this to be an interesting read. There's a reason to suspect that even a verb like made actually has the verb make inside of it and a past tense morpheme. So, in other words, that the syntax, the morphosyntax of the word made is actually not interestingly different than the morphosyntax of the verb kicked, but it's only when we have to kind of spell it out in the phonology when the irregular starts to pop up, right? And so this is not to deny that we have to memorize that the past tense form of the verb made, the past tense form of the verb make is special and pronounced made, but it is to deny that the verb made is not composed in the bigger procedural system. So if you're interested in morphology, do look at this blog post and think about this. Morantz has some other kind of points he makes about Pinker's model that I think are interesting. Full disclosure, I was an employee of Alec Morantz for 3 years, so I might be biased here. I do like his theory of how word structure works. So I'm biased here, but do look at that, and it is kind of an interesting read to think about. So there's a couple of kind of shaky parts to Pinker's theory, but again, I think this is, in some sense, the kind of traditional or kind of default linguistic view, and it maps onto a theory of grammar that I think sounds familiar, right? Where you have the system that generates new expressions, and then you have the atomic units that that system gets to operate over. And I think it also explains both the developmental data fairly well. It basically has some interesting things to say about kind of bigger morphological patterns, that again, there's more to say there. And it also says some interesting things about what we see in aphasia, when people have brain damage, which again, there's a little bit more to say about that, but there's some interesting points there that don't follow in any obvious way from the McClelland and Rumelhart model. Again, when we think about things like ChatGPT, we should ask ourselves, well, what do we know about how humans do things? What do we know from human neuroscience? And does ChatGPT say anything about that? Maybe the answer is no, maybe it's yes, but we have to ask the question, yeah? So obviously, as I said, no scientific debate is really ever fully resolved, So McClellan and Rumelhart's side had a response to the response, and so on and so forth ad infinitum. So this was a response by Seidenberg and Plaut, and they make a couple of kind of bigger theoretical points, I think, that say, why did people not just immediately give up on Rumelhart and McClellan's model? Rumelhart and McClellan, right, continued to develop their model, and that, in some senses, was the birth of neural networks that then produced things like ChatGPT, right? This is kind of the ancestor of, in some sense, of what we are talking about. So, so why was their model influential? Well, there's a few reasons. It's a very elegant theory if it can work. There's no distinction between rules and grammar on one hand and the exception of the lexicon on the other. And if we can pull that off, that's a good thing, right? This is applying Occam's razor, right? We have if we can get by with fewer theoretical jigamabobs, right? That's good. We should try to do that. So let's see if we can pull that off. So if their model can work, we should prefer it. We should try to pursue that. It also, right, has no need for things like rules, right? We can generalize through forms without having to memorize some like system of procedural knowledge, which again, if we can pull that off, that's a good thing. It uses this kind of bottom-up learning system, right? So it's all through exposure. There's no need to posit like hypothesis testing, like we suggested that we might need for children. So that's interesting. And it's also a general learning architecture. Nothing about this model necessarily has to do with past tense or morphology or words or even language, right? Neural networks are great for things like image recognition or, like cancer diagnosis or spam filtering. Like this learning system is a general learning system. You just have to spell out how information gets in and how information gets out and how to train the model. And so if we can show that this general architecture can work for language, that's interesting because that suggests that, this general architecture might be a general architecture in the human mind as well. And lastly, this is a point that I think is, worth stressing. They have a formal computational model. That means you can run the code and you can see if it works. You can see what its predictions are. This is also true for things like ChatGPT. We can go and ask ChatGPT what it thinks the next word in a sentence might be, for instance, right? And that is useful. That gives you some like concrete baseline. You can say, this is what the model says. That is not always true for informal models that we have in psycholinguistics or language acquisition or so on. A lot of models in linguistics are not always formal in this sense, right? In the sense where you can go and like program the model and ask it a question about what its predictions are. It's nice when we can do that, right? Because then we really can test that model in a very precise and explicit way. But sometimes that's not always possible. And sometimes a lot of the models we use in language research don't have that property. And that's not a good thing, I think, right? It's good when we can test things explicitly. And lastly, there is one empirical point, which we've already mentioned. Sometimes there's more than one answer, or sometimes people aren't super sure on what they think the past tense of a form is. And sometimes they can extend irregular forms to new cases. If you're Pinker and you haven't memorized an irregular form for a verb, and then there's only one answer, and the answer is you have to use the regular form. But that's not true. That's not how humans do things. So if you give a human a verb like plip or plomph, you're gonna get the past tense form plipped and plomphed if they know English, right? Those forms are gonna get the regular form. But as we already saw, if you give someone the verb form bling or gling, you might get blinged, you might get glinged, but you might get blang or blung, and you might get glang or glung, right? That's actually very hard for Pinker to explain. Why should you extend an irregular form to a novel form if there's no reason to? If it's not part of your memorized list of exceptions, then why would you consider doing this? Now, we can add to Pinker's model, but why, right? So, why bother doing that? Seidenberg and Plaut say. Now, this is obviously, I want to say this is not linguists have noticed these cases before. This is not news to linguists. These are sometimes called islands of reliability. There's other ways to talk about this. There are ways of modeling this in a model like Pinker's, but it does complicate the model, I have to say. Like, it is hard to capture these subregularities, no matter who you are. Even if you're McClellan-Rumlart, I would say, these subregularities are kind of challenging, right? So that is kind of the state of the debate. As far as I'm aware, I think most linguists would say that Pinker basically won this debate, but I don't know if everybody would admit that. I don't know if cognitive scientists all would say Pinker totally won this debate, right? Or I don't know if everyone's necessarily in agreement about this. As I said, most scientific debates don't really resolve because one side absolutely wins. Usually the debates kind of end because people get bored or start doing other things, or someone retires, and then kind of people kind of move on to other things, and then people return to the debate 10, 20 years later, right? That's usually how these things work, unfortunately. And I don't know for a fact that everyone agrees that Pinker won. I think Pinker's side is, again, broadly right. Maybe the details are interestingly wrong, and then it's worth kind of saying something about that, but generally speaking, I think that's kind of the opinion of most linguists. So now let's return to the bigger question, right? About let's move past the past tense and think about the bigger question. What about these bigger models that are now in the center of attention, right? What about large language models? So we can do what Pinker did with the Rumelhart-McClellan model, which is what language acquisitionists do with children. And that is asking, what does the input look like? What does the learning algorithm look like? And then we can do experiments to ask what kind of behavior is produced, what kind of knowledge is gleaned from the input and the learning algorithm. And we can ask, how similar, how different is that to what human children do? And what is interestingly similar and what is interestingly different? So the first thing I want to mention, right, is that we know that children learn some things from small data, whereas artificial intelligence systems have to learn from big data. This is this is not, I didn't coin this. This is something I got from a PhD advisor, Colin Phillips, who liked to make the contrast between quote unquote big data and small data, right? We already mentioned in passing that we think children maybe can learn some words from 1 or 2 tokens. We call this fast mapping. So having to learn from hundreds of millions of iterations over and over and over again, that's probably not a good approximation of what the input looks like or what the learning algorithm looks like, right? But people are starting to play with this. They're trying to explore this. So this is new research. I can't even really give you a summary of some of the findings because it's too new. But in computational linguistics, there's been what's called the Baby Language Model Project. So instead of training a large language model on billions and billions and billions and trillions of sentences, we can train it on childis. We can train language models on realistic approximations of what children hear as estimated by things like childis, the repository of corpora of child-directed speech. And then we can ask, what is learnable from that data set, right? What kinds of generalizations about language are gleaned from input to children? And again, if I can't even really give you a summary of some of the findings because it's still brand new and people are still looking into this, and that work is still getting published. If you're curious about this, right, I would suggest that you Google Baby LM, and you can, look into this. I would, remember in this class, you need to find papers that are outside of the scope of what we lecture on and give me a small report on that. Reporting on a Baby LM result would be a great place to look, right? So that's one place you can start looking if you're curious to know more about this. The other thing that we can do is we can do experiments on things like ChatGPT to ask what kinds of linguistic generalizations do we get from that. So one of the optional readings that I assigned is this paper here called Large Language Models and the Argument from the Poverty to Stimulus. This is an exploration of the kinds of island phenomena that ChatGPT knows. So we will talk about islands in a little bit more detail in 2 weeks, I believe. And islands are a kind of a weird fact about language, which is that there are certain kinds of structures that don't allow movement out of them. So by movement, right, we mean, you might have psycholinguistics call these filler gap dependencies. There are kind of contexts in which we can't have, for instance, a double H expression cross, right? So in this paper, they specifically look at an example called parasitic gaps. A parasitic gap is a very unusual kind of island phenomenon. So let's just first like acknowledge what we mean by an island. So here's a grammatical sentence. I know who John met recently. This is a very fine sentence of English. The double H word who is understood as the object of the verb met. Yeah? Easy sentence to understand. But English, and in fact many if not all languages, observe a generalization or a rule called the coordinate structure constraint that says you cannot move out of a phrase that's conjoined with another phrase. So look at this sentence. I know who John met recently and is going to annoy you soon. That sounds pretty weird. It sounds pretty weird for who to be the object of the verb met and also have that phrase coordinated with another phrase. Excuse me. So that sounds pretty bizarre, right? So that's an island violation, and you might be thinking at this point, wait a second, this is like a really bizarre thing. Who cares about this island stuff? This doesn't really impede communication. But that's the point. Like, this is a weird fact about language. If I were designing language, I would not have thought to add this into my set of rules, right? This is a bizarre thing, but yet it still seems to be pretty robust. People seem to have pretty clear judgments about this, which means you know it. You learned it somehow. So either this is lousy in the input, you are exposed to all kinds of data that cue you to know that you're not supposed to move out of a verb phrase if that verb phrase has been conjoined with another verb phrase. That seems unlikely to me. Or this somehow falls out of that initial state, right? There's something about the way that grammar is built that explains this, even though this seems like a really weird fact, right? So one hopes that universal grammar doesn't say, don't move out of a conjoined verb phrase. That's also not a good theory, right? One hopes that this follows from a more general principle or a more general rule of how language works normally. And then this is a consequence of something else, right? But here's the interesting part. And again, this is weird, right? Like, we should be weirded out by this. We should be weirded out that we seem to know this, and we have gotten this knowledge somehow. Like, somehow we have acquired this knowledge. This island goes away. This sounds good if we put another gap in the sentence. And in this case, if I take that you out of the sentence and put in another gap, now it sounds good. I know who John met recently and is going to annoy soon sounds fine. So if who is the object of the verb met and who is the object of the verb annoy, now it sounds good, right? So this is a generalization that through the sum of your biological endowment, that's a fancy way of saying your human brain, and the input that you got from your environment, somehow that sums up to this knowledge, right? Of this really weird fact about English. I love islands. I think they're so weird. That's why they're cool, right? And one of the things that this paper by Roni Katzir points out is ChatGPT does not know this. ChatGPT actually tends to find the sentences with gaps in the right place, namely this kind of sentence you're looking at here. ChatGPT finds these sentences to be surprising, but the ungrammatical sentences to be not surprising. So it has the reverse opinion, let's say, right? It has the reverse pattern. And that makes sense if what these models are doing is learning which words come next given the input. It's unusual to have the verb annoy without an object, right? So if it's weird to have the verb annoy without an object, then this structure is weird because, look, the verb annoy doesn't have an object, right? So it doesn't understand this more general feature of how the grammar is kind of sewn together that is important for understanding what this sentence means and understanding that this is grammatical, but the alternative wasn't. So I actually copied and pasted the wrong figure. I'm just now realizing this is looking at a slightly different parasitic gap. Um, I know who's John. I know who John's talking to is going to annoy soon versus annoy you soon. And again, what's basically found here is that the sentence that's kind of unusual or ungrammatical gives less of a surprisal response, which is basically a way of estimating how unusual something is, and it gives the grammatical sentence a higher surprisal response. So if you're interested in syntax, if you're interested in islands or parasitic gaps, there's actually a number of papers that have come out on this kind of topic, and this is another interesting place for you to kind of explore for your kind of extracurricular writing. So just to sum up, right? Just to sum up, we've been talking for the last 2 weeks about how children learn language and why that's so important, right? So remember, one of the major contributions that Chomsky has made to the way that we do linguistics is centering that question of how do learners of a language learn language. And as we've already mentioned, there's kind of a couple of ingredients here. There's the poverty to stimulus argument. The poverty to stimulus argument is in some sense a rhetorical argument. It's not even really necessarily scientific argument, I think. And the rhetorical move is to point out that you have to have some biases, some prior hypothesis space, some way of evaluating hypotheses. Something has to be prior in order to learn anything. And specifically about language, we can estimate what information is actually available in the input, and we can consider what some hypotheses might be. And the finding is, sometimes there are some genuine cases where the information available in the input seems to suggest one analysis, but it's not the analysis children get, right? So the Lisa Pearl paper kind of gives examples of that more forcefully than I did here. And the solution to the poverty to stimulus problem is universal grammar, right? So we suppose that the way children solve this problem is the stuff inside of their head, right? So there's something that you are born with, some information, some capacity or knowledge that you have prior to language acquisition that enables you, but not a cat or a primate or a rock or whatever it is, to learn language. That's the weak version of that hypothesis. The stronger version of that hypothesis is that includes grammatical structure. Again, my personal bias here, my prior bias, is that the strong version is right? That things like islands kind of justify that there has to be some knowledge of grammatical structure that implies these weird facts about language that we somehow come to know. And large language models or ChatGPT or so on might be useful. Again, I'm kind of showing my prior biases here. Let me say something nice about ChatGPT. Let me say something nice about large language models. I think they are useful for learning about learning, right? I think they give us some existence proof for what could be learnable in principle if you have a learner with tons and tons of memory, with thousands and hundreds of thousands of years of exposure to data, right, which would be the analog of terabytes and terabytes of data, and with a brain the size of an ocean that has tons and tons and tons and tons of parameters that you can fix and manipulate, right? So it's interesting as a way of exploring input. It's an interesting way of exploring, like, in the limit, what could be learnable from different kinds of bodies of data. And I think it's also interesting to ask questions like we're doing now, which is to ask questions about what are the limits on that capacity of the generalizations that we pull from it, right? So maybe we can learn something about what might need to be in universal grammar by exploring what even the largest of large language models struggle to get right. So if large language models are bad about reasoning about islands, but 3-year-olds aren't, maybe that tells us something interesting about 3-year-olds, right? That's, again, my opinion here. But again, the jury is still out. This is still a super active area of research. This is still super debated. There's a lot to say about this, right? And I think we still have a long ways to go. I think there's still a lot of things we have yet to learn from large language models and thinking about this very seriously as a comparison to what humans do. And I think that's, we're going to learn a lot about learning. And I think that is going to be a benefit to even those of us, like myself, who still advocate for the strong version of the universal grammar hypothesis.